Hi, hello. This is the second video uh, of the sequence. So in this specific segment, I'd like to discuss with you some usual criticisms directed to quantitative methods. There are, of course, many of them, but I chose a small number of criticisms to address in this conversation. I chose the ones that I think could be more relevant for the purpose of this interaction. But first and foremost, let me make it clear that, well, this is my personal approach to the problem. This is not a consensus in the field, but I think there is relevant to raise and discuss these four specific ones in the context of our interaction here. So, well, quantitative methods, of course, they can and must be criticized. They have their blind spots and faults and their limits. And it's important for every user of quantitative methods to be well aware of this situation, so they will understand better what can and cannot be achieved using quantitative methods. Qualitative researchers tend to be among the critics of quantitative methods, but you perhaps could be surprised if you hear that most of the harshest critiques of quantitative methods are the most advanced practitioners and users of that family of techniques, because exactly they know the limits and faults and blind spots of quantitative methods, but they also understand these methods have the ability to make important contributions, and they keep therefore working to improve those methods. So in this video, I'd like to discuss four recurrent or usual criticism of quantitative methods. They seem to be especially relevant for our conversation here, but as we will see, many of the criticisms directed to quantitative methods can also be applied to qualitative methods. So it's important to keep this in mind because they share some of the main problems discussed in terms of research ethics, research methods and field work, and so on. And of course, what we can do out of the data we collect, right? So let's start with the first critique here, which is a sort of original sin of quantitative methods. Quantitative methods, they are based on statistics, or they use statistical procedures to collect and examine data. And many important figures in the rise and consolidation of modern statistics, especially around the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, many of the founding fathers of modern statistics from those days, they were eugenists. And they used their skills and used statistics to provide evidence that eugenism should be implemented or should be defended as an adequate way to deal with the future of their nations. And this movement among statisticians was specifically, not only but especially strong in the United Kingdom. Nowadays, we will not find as many defenders of eugenism or the use of statistics to discriminate against populations. You still will find some of them, especially those, for instance, associated to the idea of the bell curve of intelligence, and that different groups would be in different points of this distribution of intelligence, at least on average. But this is not the dominant aspect in the field nowadays. And yes, the role of eugenists in the development of statistical methods have been acknowledged by many practitioners in the field, have been discussed, and some recommendations and modes and ways to deal with this background have been seriously taken into account and offered as a way to change or to address these issues in the discipline. But it's interesting to notice that the accusation of this original sin equally applies to qualitative methods, right? Many of the founding fathers of modern anthropology and ethnography, they were servants of empire. They were sent in missions to domains and colonies all over the world to learn about the natives, quote unquote, so the authorities would have more information and a better understanding of how they could dominate those populations. And they set the background for the development of many anthropological methods, specifically or especially ethnography, to the point that in the 1970s, Diana Lewis, an anthropologist, argued in one of our articles that anthropology emerged from the colonial expansion of Europe. I think a good example of this not so noble past of anthropology is Bronislaw Malinowski. Malinowski is one of the founding fathers of ethnography. He made, and it must be acknowledged, he made important contributions for the development of this methodology. And if you read his book, he's not exactly against or hostile the populations he studied, and he acknowledged the cultural richness in those places. But after his death, his wife published his research diaries, and oh goodness, in his diaries, which of course were written as private memoirs, in his diaries he make explicit all his perhaps true opinions about those populations. Let's here take a look at one passage from his diaries in which it makes clear, this passage makes clear that Malinowski saw the local populations he was studying and he treated those populations as sources of data for him to make a successful career in Europe. It's clear that he approached or he understood his interactions with those populations in a very extractive manner. So there's some passages here that I would like to highlight. Well, in this entry in his diary, he says, well, all that day longing for civilization, I thought about friends in Melbourne. At night, in the dengue, pleasantly ambitious thoughts in his mind, of course. I will surely be an eminent Polish scholar. This will be my last ethnographical escapade. After that, I will devote myself to constructive sociology, methodology, political economy, etc. And in Poland, I can realize my ambitions better than anywhere else. A strong contrast between my dreams of civilized life and my life with the savages. Some could say that Malinowski was just a man of his time, but it's undeniable, based on this evidence here, that his relationship with his with participants in his research were not exactly positive, at least inside his mind and at the bottom of his heart. But if we bring this argument nowadays, many anthropologists and ethnographers will rightly argue that, well, this root of modern anthropology and ethnography is true, but for decades anthropologists have been engaged in self-reflection about their practices and methods. They have taken ethical issues more seriously than ever to make sure that the same mistakes and the same extractivist and disrespectful relationship will not happen again. But what about quantitative researchers? Well, haven't they been engaged in similar reflections? Well, yes, they have been doing it as well. There are strong movements, or there's an emerging movement to decolonize and diversify quantitative methods, which includes acknowledging this eugenist past of statistics and quantitative methods. They are well aware of how malpractice and the misuse of statistical techniques and knowledge have social impacts, nefarious social impacts. And there's also certain demands to reform the curriculum of research methods courses so they can incorporate these recent advances in the field to the training of students. So let's now move towards the second issue in my list, which is positivism, probably the most recurrent one, that quantitative methods are eminently positivist. And for this reason, they would carry this pretense of objectivity, right? I think this critique stems from two different connections or two different understandings or relationships or reflections on positivism. The first, I think, it is related to some degree of misunderstanding of what positivism is or what it proposed. I'm not here defending positivism. I'm not a positivist myself, but the critique directed to quantitative methods of being positivist because positivism aims to achieve objectivity and the absolute truth. This is not applicable. In the next slides, I will provide you some evidence from the founding father of positivism about what the positivist agenda aimed for. And second, and probably more important, is that calling quantitative methods positivist are also misplaced because quantitative methods, they are not positivist, because positivism, I argue, is an impossibility in the construction of learning. There are limitations in how humans can learn about the world that makes this promise of positivism impossible. Some of the arguments demonstrating these limitations in the ways that human can learn about the world or interact with the world, some of these arguments are 100 years old, but for some reason apparently they haven't been incorporated in this understanding of what different methods can do. And if you don't want to go that further back in the past, in the mid-20th century, the famous philosopher of science Karl Popper spent and built most of his career demonstrating very convincingly, I would say, that positivism is not implementable. The promises of positivism cannot be achieved. But let's dig a little bit more on positivism. Well, Auguste Comte is a French philosopher who founded positivism in the mid-19th century. He proposed positivism to be a sort of all-encompassing philosophy that would bring together all different fields of knowledge, and later he turned positivism into a religion that would be based on science in many senses, right? He was not very successful in creating a religion. There are very few practitioners of positivism as a religion nowadays. The only two temples, or the only two positivist temples that I'm aware of, they are in Brazil, one in Rio de Janeiro, one in Porto Alegre. But even in those two cities is not a large, a numerous movement. So in a sense, yes, the positivist as a religion was created or evolved in that direction in some cases, but it's not a very numerous movement. There are not so many followers out there. But, well, back to the positivism as a form of, or philosophy of knowledge, even Auguste Comte, in his very first book, he acknowledged the impossibility of achieving the absolute truth. So this idea was ruled out from the very beginning of positivism. It doesn't mean positivism should be supported. It has many other flaws, but it starts the idea of absolute truth and objectivity has been discarded. Right? What Auguste Comte offered instead was using observations and reasoning to discover broad general laws that would govern both the natural and the social world. I don't think this is achievable as well, as decades of experience has been shown, at least in the social sciences. But the reliance of positivism on observation is what makes positivism impossible. Because humans only learn about the world, they interact with the world through cultural lenses. So our senses do not have direct access to reality, or if they do, the way these inputs, so to speak, are processed in our brains, if you wish, these inputs are filtered by cultural categories. Therefore, knowledge is culturally located. There is, for sure, powerful, engaging literature on the matter in the recent decades, but surprisingly or not, the argument that humans cannot have this direct access to the world, or that humans perceive and organize the world according to these cultural and social categories, this argument was first made by Émile Durkheim before World War I. So this is a more than 100 years old argument. So anyone who believes or claims that one of the major problems with quantitative methods is that they are positivist, this may not be as powerful of an argument as it may initially sound, because positivism, for these reasons I presented and others, is not a possibility. It's out of the scope of the human possibility to learn about the world. There is a huge discussion about this, which I cannot condense here in a few minutes. But accusing quantitative methods of something that is impossible may either be a misunderstanding of what quantitative methods can do, or a misunderstanding of the capacities or capabilities of learning about the world, or worse, if practitioners claim to be able to provide this absolute truth, this is what I would call professional malpractice, because this is not possible at all. So let me move on to my third element here. So one argument that's sometimes presented against the use of quantitative methods in the study of societies is that, well, numbers are not adequate to understand the human complexity. That's true in many senses. Numbers are unable to capture all the nuances of reality. It cannot capture even as many nuances as words can in certain situations. So from this is derived that the argument that numbers cannot express what we want in terms of what values, feelings, emotions are. True enough. Numbers cannot do that. However, words are also limited in what they can express and encompass. As we know, for instance, certain words only exist in certain languages. So there is a limitation in what can be expressed using words in the very structure of language. Language constrains our possibilities of expressing and even understanding and communicating certain emotions or certain feelings, certain values. And to add a second layer of complication to that, when we operate in a multilingual environment, translation itself makes difficult to transmit and communicate certain ideas that the person or the speaker had in one specific language. There is this, if I'm not mistaken, this Italian saying that traduttori e traitori, translation is treason, because translation cannot never encompass the full meaning and understanding of the original language. So depending on the direction this argument goes, that numbers cannot capture and communicate certain levels of complexity, which is true. Depending on how this argument is used, it can also affect words and language in terms of what we can do. It doesn't mean that we stop using words, for instance, in publications, right? But it's also important to understand that numbers, in their own limitations, they are useful tools, just as words and letters, to record and communicate findings, ideas, issues, and so on. It's just a matter that numbers are better to communicate certain ideas and words are better to communicate in other ideas. And words in a different language may be even better to communicate certain ideas than, for instance, English or Portuguese or Spanish or Arabic and so on, right? And finally, the idea that that numbers are not humans or not humane in the sense that they are artificial ways to communicate ideas because they cannot encompass and cover these more symbolic dimensions that humans carry. On this specific issue, I would just claim that numbers and mathematics is probably one of the most human things ever, because it's impressive how different societies in different points of history, in different places, developed counting systems, developed ways to deal with numbers, user numbers to deal concrete issues, right? So if there is one thing that is human, are numbers, because numbers that don't exist in nature. They are part of a logic system that humans in different societies created. So there are different counting systems, different ways to deal with numbers, but they are created by humans. So if there's the argument that numbers are not good to tackle or to communicate or to express human complexity, well, many societies have been doing this all over the history, and numbers has been used in a useful way to communicate certain ideas, but not all. So it's important to expect from numbers what numbers can provide us. Finally, there is this idea or this argument that quantitative methods and numbers have been misused and abused and used in ways that have important consequences in society. And this is a very important point. Under this umbrella idea that of misuses, political misuses of numbers, I would highlight 3 of them, or 4 of them that I will treat in 3 different blocks, and I think they are very important to be considered seriously because they had serious consequences for social and human life. Well, one of them, or the first 2 that I will treat together here, is the mispractice or the misunderstandings or the lack of explanation and consideration of what data production is, how it works, and how these numbers and data can be used, right? And this is connected to the second point, which many of us have to deal frequently, is this idea of economicism and how certain disciplines use numbers and hide themselves under this mask of impartiality and use certain lingo and expressions and jargons that ends up hiding relevant information from non-specialists. Well, this idea of impartiality in the use of numbers, it's very problematic because human decisions are all part of the data collection process and the data collection analysis and the data analysis. Many decisions have to be made about what data will be collected, how data will be collected, how we will store and how we will analyze this data. So the idea that it's possible to have an impartial take on data production and analysis, this is not a possibility, right? Human decisions are made here all the time. And there's a funny anecdote that a colleague recently shared with me. This colleague was designing a new course on quantitative methods, and they aimed, he and his and the team, the teaching team, they wanted to track how the attitudes toward quantitative methods changed over the course of that training. So in the very first class, they asked students to fulfill a questionnaire, and one of the items there was what you believe to be one of the major advantages of quantitative methods. And a very common response was, well, quantitative methods are very objective, right? So the course started, and one class after the other, students were exposed to different aspects of research methodology, quantitative research methodology. And there was a class on questionnaire design and construction. And then students finally had this first-hand experience with the design of an instrument to collect data. What will include, how will you measure these different ideas, what will be the acceptable responses for this question, how will you ask these questions, which concepts will you encompass here, and so on. After that class on research questionnaire, or on design of research questionnaires, my colleague and his and other members of the teaching team applied the questionnaire again. And this time, students were not very enthusiastic about the objectivity of quantitative methods, because they noticed finally all the decisions that have to be made by humans in the process of collecting data, from who and from where that data would be collected, how that data will be analyzed. So sometimes I think some exposure to proper training on quantitative methods may be enough, perhaps, to dismantle the idea of objectivity, right? There are other issues as well, a part of this economicism and impartiality dimension, which is the opacity and the use of technical expressions and jargons frequently. In some contexts, it's okay to do it. If you are in an academic conference talking and chatting with other specialists, certain concepts and terms will be very useful in transmitting certain ideas and information to the other person. But not exactly, it won't work the same way if you talk to the general public using that lingo. This is an issue to be addressed, and I quite frankly, I'm not sure this is due to professional malpractice, professional training, or the idea of self-importance. This is something to be explored, but this is an issue to be tackled as well. So let's move to the second issue related to colonialism and imperialism. Colonialism and imperialism made extensive use of data collection. For instance, census and population counting have been used to collect large amount of information about the population for population control and in many cases for taxations, and this from immemorial times. This is not something that emerged in modernity with the creation of modern states. Other forms of political organizations use this procedure to learn about populations to better control them. And of course, that counting is power, right? If you one entity has the capacity to learn and to gather extensive information from population, this has political consequences as well. Because who counts, why the counting is happening, what is being counted, by whom? This has serious political consequences in terms of the knowledge and understanding of social dynamics. And kept in secret, this information can be used as tools of control. So this is a very important issue for us to address as well. And this is a valid criticism when these issues are in place. And finally, going back to the very first issue about this original scenes of statistics, is eugenics, which was an important political movement around a century ago. And as I mentioned, some of the founding fathers of modern statistics, who were brilliant thinkers, very competent professionals, owners of brilliant minds, they were misguided in their practice by their political orientations, which is just another example of the influence of our mental categories and social categories and ideologies in how we deal with data, how we process data, how we interpret data, right? Here in these two pictures, we have Carl Persson and Ronald Fisher, who are probably the two of the major contributors to the foundations of modern statistics, and we were both eugenists. Carl Persson specifically wrote volumes and series of articles about eugenism. There is one specific piece of research produced by Persson that caught my attention. He and his co-author, Margaret Moore, they wrote, and this explains very well, demonstrates very well what were his political motivations. They wrote a series of at least 6 articles titled "The Problem of Aiding Immigration into Great Britain, Illustrated by an Examination of Russian and Polish Jewish Children." Putting these 6 articles together, or at least 6 articles together, published in a journal, surprise, surprise, called Annals of Eugenics, Persson dedicated hundreds of pages to justify eugenist ideas using statistics, right? This is a serious issue as we all understand it. Of course, this has to be combated. If nowadays either statistics or other science, for instance genetics, are used to discriminate against populations, this has to be acknowledged, this has to be criticized, and action has to be taken. But back to, again, to my first slide, eugenism is certainly a serious issue, and it has to be addressed in the history, in a better understanding of the history of statistics. It doesn't mean that all current statistics or all current practitioners are eugenists. This is not the case for sure. I'm not one of them, one of the eugenists for sure. So many and all colleagues I have working with, and most of colleagues I have ever interacted with, they are very mindful of this dark past of statistics, and there is important effort to address this issue, for instance, in statistical classes, on the origins of the disciplines, how certain formulas and procedures developed back in the day were used by their creators to address social and political issues and so on. So this is a serious issue and it has to be addressed. And fortunately, this has been addressed by the community. In this slide, I just provide an abstract for an article published on cow-person and eugenics. I will not read the entire abstract here. If you want to do so, pause the video and read it. This article was published 10 years ago, and it calls exactly attention that our procedures are influenced by our personal opinions. The abstract starts stating that the influence of personal opinions and biases on scientific conclusions is a threat to the advantage of knowledge, which should not be conflated. I would say here that it's possible to be unbiased or proceed in scientific endeavors without bringing our personal opinions together. But those opinions have to be checked by our peers and in a way that our conclusions are not distorted by what we aim to do. And that's why replication in science is so important, right? And the authors continue, even the most talented among us can produce misleading results when interferences are made without caution or reference to potential bias and other analysis limitations. And this is a clear criticism of what cow-person and others back in the day were doing. They were using some of the most advanced knowledge at the time without paying attention to the biases or issues that their assumptions carried into the analysis, right? So this is an issue. This is just an illustration of how this issue has been addressed and debated by the community of practitioners of quantitative methods. So again, to wrap up this long segment, quantitative methods deserve and need to be criticized. Quantitative methods and statistics have a large and long laundry list to deal with, but practitioners, as I mentioned earlier in this conversation, they are well aware of these issues. They are very critical of what they do. But because they also understand what can be done in a positive sense, they are constantly reflecting and revising their practice in terms of improving their methods and so on. What can be done is the question that I left you with to address this for different problems that I raised here. And if you think there are other criticisms that can be directed to quantitative methods, please let's chat about it. So with this, I end this segment. See you soon.